The human family. When and where did it begin? Have you thought about the origin of the human family? Do you know the identity of the first man and woman who started the human family? Do you know when they were alive on this earth? You may be among those people who don't believe the Bible when it says Adam and Eve were the first man and woman. So let's ask another question. Is there an ancient civilization on earth that tells a story of a first man and woman who started the human family? Let's visit ancient Egypt and look at the story of their first man and woman. And while we're at it, let's see if their first man and woman look anything like Adam and Eve in the Bible. The Egyptians say that Nebuchadnezzar, Shu, and Tefnut are the oldest trinity in ancient Egypt, and Nebuchadnezzar caused Shu and Tefnut to bring forth the first man and woman, Geb and Nut. The Egyptians say that Shu forcibly separated Nut from the embrace of Geb. Is there a story like that in the Bible? Well, the Bible says that Adam was the first man. He was created by God, then God took a rib out of Adam and made a woman named Eve from that rib. The Egyptians say that Nut was forcibly separated from the embrace of Geb. An embrace brings two people chest to chest, and rib bones are in the chest. The two stories describe the beginning of the first woman using different words, but with the same result. The first women in the two stories were both separated from the chest or ribs of the first men in the two stories. So the first man in the two stories was created, and the first woman in the two stories was taken away from or out of the first man's chest. It's beginning to look like the first man and woman in Egypt and the first man and woman in the Bible are the same two people, making them the father and mother of the entire human family. Is there more evidence? As we look at the evidence and the names of these ancient people, let's set them in a time frame. This time frame includes dates marked BC, which means before Christ. It also includes dates marked AM, which means age of man, beginning at 0 AM, when the first man was created in this story. The Egyptians called Nut the mighty mother. She was taken out of the chest of the first man, and she was the first to give birth to a human child. Before that, no human child had ever been born. Nut herself was never born. So Nut and Eve are the same woman, the first to give birth to a human child. And this woman with two names, Nut and Eve, was never born. Since Nut and Eve are the same woman, then the firstborn son of Nut, who was Osiris, should be the same as the firstborn son of Eve, who was Cain. The name Osiris is actually not his birth name. His birth name is actually Kensu, from the root word kens, meaning to travel, to move about, and to run. The name Ken sounds very similar to the name Cain, so this is evidence that Ken and Cain, the two firstborn sons, are actually the same man. The Egyptian story says Osiris was the first to bring agriculture to Egypt. The Bible says Cain was a tiller of the ground. This is more evidence that Cain and Osiris were the same man, the tiller of the ground who was the first to bring agriculture to Egypt, and the firstborn son of the first woman. We'll see more evidence later on. It's beginning to look like the first people in Egypt are the same as the first people in the Bible. The second-born son of Nut in Egypt was Horus the Elder. He is said to have the attributes of the great cosmic moral creator God. Is there a man like him in the Bible? Well, the Bible says that the second-born son of Adam and Eve was Abel. God called Abel a righteous man. So this second son of Eve had the same righteous character traits as the second son of Nut, who had the attributes of the great cosmic moral creator God. So they both appear to be the same righteous man. The third-born son of Nut in Egypt was named Seth. Is there a man like him in the Bible? Well, the Bible says that the third-born son of Adam and Eve was also named Seth. So these two third-born sons named Seth are both the same man. The evidence is piling up that the first man and woman in the Bible and in Egypt are both the same people. Also, their three sons are the same people in both stories. Let's look back at the first and second born sons in these two stories. From the Bible, we see Cain and Abel. From Egypt, we see Kensu and Horus the elder. Reading in Genesis 4, verse 8, it says, Cain killed his brother Abel. This is the first record of a man being killed in the Bible. So Cain is the first in history to kill a man, and Abel was the first man in history to die. After this killing in verse 8, it says in verse 25 that Adam had his third son named Seth. If these Bible verses 8 through 25 follow a time sequence, then it appears that Cain killed Abel before Seth was born. Genesis 5 verse 3 says Seth was born when Adam was 130 years old. So it appears that Abel was killed within 130 years after Adam was created on this earth. Looking at more details from this first family, we see in the Egyptian story that there was a god in Egypt named Atem. He was the first man among Egyptians who was believed to have become divine and who was at his death identified with the setting sun. Atem was the first living man-god known to the Egyptians. He was also the son of Nut, so if Nut was Eve and she had a son who was the first man to die, then Atem could be none other than Abel of the Bible or Horus the elder of the Egyptian story. We have already seen that Abel was the first man to die in the Bible. This is more evidence that the sons of the first man and woman are the same sons in both stories of Egypt and the Bible. In Genesis 3, verse 4, Satan the serpent told Adam, "You shall not surely die." So Adam or Geb added to this story that Atem became divine following his death, indicating that he had an afterlife in another place following his death. Egyptians believed he didn't really die. So Atem was the dead man named Abel, or Horus the elder, who was killed before Adam or Geb was 130 years old. Geb wore the white crown. It was not always the crown of Upper Egypt. It was originally the crown of Khenti-Amenti, the chief of the people of the west at Abydos. Since the sun sets in the west where it dies each day, the people of the west at Abydos are those people who are dead and buried on the west side of the Nile, towards where the sun sets each day. Amenta or Amentet was originally the place where the sun set. It later applied to cemeteries and tombs. The righteous dead Abel, or Atem, or Horus the elder, was provided by Geb with the necessary words of power, enabling him to escape the earth in which his dead body lay. When other people died, Geb was appealed to by those deceased for help against the serpents. The wicked dead were held fast to the earth by Geb. Geb was surely Khenti-Amenti, since he was the first to wear the white crown, and his son Horus the elder, or Abel, was the first man to die. The god Atem gave his father Geb the title ruler of the world. He was also called the Lord of the earth and the Protector. This rank was established by Atem. Atem must have established it before he was killed while he was still alive and known as Horus the elder or Abel of the Bible. But after he was killed and became Atem, his ruling stood as though a god established Geb as ruler of the world. Atem was known as the first living man-god. He was righteous Abel of the Bible and Horus the elder of Egypt. Egyptians recognized his righteousness by saying he had the attributes of the great cosmic moral creator God. We now see the identity of the first man and woman in the Bible and the first man and woman in Egypt. We have also identified the first three sons in the Bible and the first three sons in Egypt, but we are left with a question. Where did the women come from who married the sons of Adam and had children from those sons? Well, the people who asked that question have missed the statement in Genesis 5, verse 4, which says Adam lived 800 years after he begat Seth, and he begat sons and daughters whose names are not given. Verse 5 says Adam lived a total of 930 years, then he died. So Adam had sons and daughters according to the Bible, and those children were brothers and sisters. The first 3 sons of Adam were named in the Bible, but the sisters that they married were not named in the Bible. However, the Egyptian story does give the names of the sisters that they married. We'll look at the marriage of the firstborn son, Kensu, after revealing some more details about his life. Kensu was the birth name for Osiris. His name comes from the root word kens, meaning to travel, move about, and to run. In Genesis 4:12, God calls Cain a fugitive and a vagabond. The word fugitive means running away or moving from place to place. The word vagabond means moving from place to place without a fixed home. The Bible and the Egyptian stories both give the same exact description of the 2 firstborn sons. They are both described as fugitives on the run. Genesis 4 verse 12 tells us why this is. It says that God drove Cain out of his native land that he cultivated after he killed his brother Abel. So Cain had to travel, move about, and run from his native land because God drove him away. The Egyptians say that Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys were 4 gods who were the earliest inhabitants of the land of Egypt. So after God drove Cain out of his native land, he ended up in Egypt with his birth name Kensu. But after some time, he changed his name to Osiris. We'll see how his name changed a little later. Kensu was the eldest son of the womb of Nut, engendered by Geb the ancestor. So he was the firstborn son of Geb. Kensu married his sister, whose birth name was Knemet-Ankh. Her name means last hour of the day, and she is the eldest daughter of Geb and Nut. She was brought forth by Nut in the form of a black-skinned or blackish-red-skinned child. It is also said that she represents the birth of the moon, which is black with a narrow crescent of light. She also changed her name to Isis when her brother husband changed his name to Osiris. Historians recognize Osiris as a black man from northern Africa, and since his sister wife Isis was born black, their firstborn son Baba was black. Genesis 4 verse 17 says Cain had a son named Enoch. He built a city and called it Enoch after his son's name. Since the first son of Osiris and Isis in Egypt is listed as Baba, and the first son of Cain in the Bible is listed as Enoch, then Baba and Enoch may be 2 names for the same man, the firstborn son of Cain in the Bible, who is Kensu or Osiris of Egypt. And since Osiris was black, then Enoch was also black, and Enoch's children were black. We'll see more about this black line of children later. We have seen that the second son of Adam was Abel, and the second son of Geb was Horus the elder. They were both considered righteous men, indicating that they were both the same man. In the Egyptian story, Horus, the second son of Geb, married his sister, the second daughter of Geb. Her name was Senet-Nofret, and she was called the Good Sister. Her qualities of being good matched the character of her husband, Horus, who was called righteous by God. The third-born son of Geb was Seth, and he married his sister, Nephthys. She was the third-born daughter of Geb and Nut. The name Nephthys comes from the hieroglyphs Nubbed Het, which means house of Seth. Het means house, and Nubbed comes from the common name for Seth in southern Egypt, which was Nubti. This is evidence indicating women at that early time in history were being given the name of their husband to show that they were part of his house or family. We have now identified the first man and woman in the Bible as the first man and woman in Egypt. We have also identified the first 3 sons in the Bible as the first 3 sons in Egypt, and we have now identified the first 3 daughters in Egypt as the sisters who married their brothers, the first 3 sons of the first man and woman, Geb and Nut. This should be enough evidence to answer our first question and say that there is an ancient civilization with a historical record of a man and a woman who can be portrayed as the father and mother of the entire human family. But we won't stop here. We're going to continue this story all the way to the first pharaoh of Egypt. Let's remember back in this story that Cain killed his brother Abel before Adam was 130 years old. Since he was the first to die, he was the first to be buried on the west side of the Nile River towards where the sun sets and dies and goes into the underground each day. A man was given the title Kentiamenti, which means chief of the people of the west at Abydos. Those people are the ones who were dead and buried on the west side of the Nile River where the sun sets. The white crown was not always the crown of Upper Egypt. It was originally the crown of Kentiamenti in the west at Abydos. We saw earlier that Geb, or Adam, was Kentiamenti, since he was the first to wear the white crown, and his son Horus, or Abel, was the first man to die. So when did Atem, or Abel, declare his father Geb to be ruler of the world? Let's speculate a little. This is not a real critical date, but we should know it. There is another date we will look at that is more important. But for now, let's say that Abel was born when Adam was about 50 years old, and he lived about 30 years before he called his father ruler of the world. That would make it 80 years after Adam was created when he was called ruler of the world. Then sometime after that, Cain killed his brother Abel before Seth was born when Adam was 130 years old. Now let's look at the important date that will give us a good structure of time in ancient Egypt. Genesis 5 verse 3 says Adam was 130 years old when his son Seth was born. Genesis 5 verse 6 says Seth was 105 years old when his son Enos was born. If you add 130 plus 105, you see that Enos was born 235 years after Geb was created here on earth. We need to know this date because Genesis 4 verse 26 says that men began to call themselves by the name of the Lord when Enos was born. See Adam Clarke's commentary for the correct translation of Genesis 4:26. My YouTube video, Egypt, When Did Dynasty 1 Begin?, establishes a timeline with Adam being created in 3984 BC. If you subtract 235, you see that Enos was born in 3749 BC. So men began calling themselves gods in 3749 BC when Enos was born. Looking at Ra and Atem, they are called the oldest gods in Egypt. They were even combined as Ra-Atem. Ra was the sun at full strength during midday. Atem was the weakened sun at setting. In the Osirian creation account, Ra is the father of Osiris, and since Geb was also the father of Osiris, Geb may be identified as Ra. So Geb, the first man Adam, was Ra the sun god. This fact will become more clear as the story develops. Abel, who was Horus the Elder, or Atem, was the first man to die, so his cult was started first. Heru was Horus the Elder. He was the oldest of all the gods in ancient Egypt. He was also known as Horus or Horus the Great. Prior to man-centered religion in Egypt, worship of animals and birds and reptiles was the most common form of religion in pre-dynastic Egypt. Egyptians believed that certain deities were incarnate in certain animals. This idea is extremely ancient and could have come from the Garden of Eden and the Tree of Life. When God put Adam and Eve out of the garden because of their sins, he placed angelic beings with animal and bird faces in the garden to guard the Tree of Life. This could be the source of animal and bird worship in ancient Egypt. Atem was the first human to replace animals in worship. Men worshipped animals as gods for 235 years until Enos was born. Then the Bible says that men began to call themselves gods. Atem was to the Egyptians a manifestation of God in human form. Their concept of him marks the end of the period wherein they assigned animal forms to their gods. The god Horus, or Atem, under the form of a hawk, appears to be the first god who was worshipped throughout the country generally. We have seen that Ra and Atem are called the oldest gods in Egypt, but Atem was the first god who was worshipped in Egypt. Atem was identified as the setting sun because he was the first to die, and the setting sun pictures the death of the sun as it goes down into the underground in the west when it sets. The death of Horus the Elder marks the beginning of a new religion in Egypt, with Horus the dead man being called a god named Atem. He began replacing animals as gods. We have seen that Adam, or Geb, is also part of this new religion. He became the sun at full strength at midday with his new name, Ra the sun god. So this new religion has two sun gods who began as men and were elevated to god status. It started with Horus or Abel, the second son of Geb, being killed and being identified with the setting sun. And since Geb, the first man, was still alive, he was elevated to the sun at full strength at midday. He became Ra the sun god. Geb, the first man, was originally called Urpat, the chief of the human family. Next he was given a throne and a title, ruler of the world. A third transformation occurred when Geb became Kenti Amenti, chief of the people of the west at Abydos. They were the ones who were dead and buried in the west, where the sun sets. A fourth transformation occurred when Geb was elevated to the god status of Ra the sun god. When that happened, he gave his earthly throne and title to his firstborn son, Kensu. Kensu, or Cain, was already the king of the Delta region and wore the red crown of the Delta, which is Lower Egypt. When Kensu was given the throne of his father Geb, he also received the white crown of his father, which was the crown of Kenti Amenti, the chief of the dead people of the west. That white crown made Osiris the new Kenti Amenti, which is one of the earliest titles of Osiris. His sister wife Isis was called Mistress of Amentet. At that time, Kensu also changed his name to the hieroglyphs Asar, which represents a throne and an eye. The hieroglyph Az represents a throne and shows that Kensu sits on the throne of his father Geb. From this point in time to the end of 30 dynasties in 3,000 years, the king of Egypt always placed himself on the throne of Geb. The hieroglyph R represents an eye, which indicates the sun. So Kensu is saying that he is the son of his father, the sun god Ra. And from the hieroglyph Asar, the Greeks derived the name Osiris, which became Kensu's new name. After he was given his father's throne, Kensu's wife Khenemet-Ankh also changed her name to Ast or Auset, which is the feminine form of the hieroglyph for a throne. So Khenemet-Ankh is saying that she rules on a throne with her husband. From Ast or Auset, Greeks derive her new name, Isis. So Kensu and his wife Khenemet-Ankh now rule together on their father's throne with their new names Asar and Ast, or Auset. This all happened in 3749 BC when Enos was born, which is 235 years after Adam was created. Many centuries later, the Greeks derived the names Osiris and Isis from the hieroglyphs Asar and Ast, or Auset. Osiris taught Egyptians to till the field and cultivate the vine. He established a code of laws and made men worship the gods. He also instructed them in various useful arts. When Egypt became peaceful and prosperous, Osiris set out to teach the other nations. Isis ruled Egypt during his absence. While Osiris was gone, Seth conspired with Aso, the queen of Ethiopia, and 72 others. Their plot was to kill Osiris. In his plan, Seth made Osiris lie down in a special chest made just for Osiris. Then Seth closed the chest and threw it into the Nile River. Osiris drowned on the 17th day of the month Athyr, in the 28th year of his reign. Osiris was slain on the dike bank at Netat near Abydos. Osiris began to reign on his father's throne when his father was elevated to the god status of Ra the sun god in 3749 BC. That was 235 years after Geb was created by God. Since Osiris reigned 28 years, we can add that to 235 and see that Osiris was killed 263 years after Geb was created. Subtract 263 from the creation date of 3984 BC and see that Osiris was killed in 3721 BC. This is another key time marker in ancient Egyptian history. There is a story saying that Osiris had a marital relationship with his sister Nephthys, the wife of his brother Seth, and she bore a son named Anubis. Plutarch says this is the reason Seth killed his older brother Osiris. There's another story that says a battle of the gods was fought in which Osiris, the lord of Amentet, was the leader. In that day Osiris died. Also in that day Horus, his son, was established by Osiris as prince and ruler. It appears from this story that Osiris had a son named Horus. This Horus is not Horus the elder, son of Geb and Nut. This Horus was Horus the younger or child, son of Isis, but the father is questionable. There is something very confusing in the story of Horus the younger. In the story with Osiris fighting in a battle of the gods, Horus appears to be a grown son when Osiris died, and Osiris was able to establish his son, Horus, as prince and ruler. Yet another story says that Osiris was resurrected from the dead by his wife Isis, and then he fathered his son Horus by his wife Isis. So which is it? Was Horus a grown son when Osiris died? Or was Horus not yet born when Osiris died? Let's look at some more details to find the true story of Horus the Younger. First of all, Isis was called several names. Number 1, daughter of Geb. Number 2, child of Nut. Number 3, daughter of the universal Lord. Number 4, consort of her father. Number 5, first royal wife of Ra. The fourth and fifth names of Isis in the above list indicate that she had a marital relationship with her own father. When Geb was elevated to the god status of Ra, the sun god, his own daughter Isis became the first royal wife of Ra. She also received the new title of a goddess called Ra-Ta'uit. Ra was the female counterpart of Ra. Egyptians say that Horus the Younger was the son of Ra-Ta'uit, and he was also said to be mighty in the house of Geb. When we analyze this evidence, we see that Geb, the first man Adam, was actually the father of Horus the Younger, because Horus was mighty in the house of Geb. And Geb's own daughter, Isis, was the mother of Horus the Younger. So Osiris was not the father of Horus the Younger. But a pattern was established when Geb gave his earthly throne to his son Osiris. By this pattern, kingship was passed from father to son, and Isis wanted that pattern to continue with her son Horus the Younger. To do that, she fabricated a story that her husband Osiris was the father of Horus the Younger. The fabricated story began when Osiris was killed by his brother Seth. Isis found the body and brought it back home, but Seth found where she hid the body and hacked it into 14 pieces and scattered them around Egypt. Isis and her sister Nephthys found the pieces of his body and put them together again. Nebercher was the name of Osiris when his scattered limbs had been brought together and built up again into a body by Isis and Nephthys. Isis is called Greater Charity because she built up Nebercher. Nephthys is called Lesser Charity because she built up Nebercher under Isis' leadership. It is at this time that Osiris was reportedly revived by Isis and fathered a child by Isis. That child was Horus, son of Isis. This fabricated story allows her son, Horus, to rule on the throne of his father Osiris. And remember, Osiris was ruling on the throne of his father, Geb. But Seth already claimed the throne of Geb after he killed Osiris. Now think about this. Seth just killed the firstborn son of Geb named Osiris, or Cain. But earlier, Osiris, or Cain, killed the second-born son of Geb named Horus the Elder, or Abel. So Cain and Abel, the first two sons of Geb, were dead, leaving the third son, Seth, as the oldest living son of Geb. So Seth claimed the throne of his father Geb by the right of being the oldest living son of Geb. And Seth claimed Horus the Younger was illegitimate. He claimed Osiris was not the father of Horus the Younger. So Horus could not claim the throne by right of father-to-son succession. This dispute over Geb's throne ended up in a battle, and Geb had to stop the battle between his two sons and make an early judgment in Egypt. He divided the land into Upper and Lower Egypt. He gave the desert around the river in Upper Egypt to Seth, and he gave the well-watered region of the delta in Lower Egypt to Horus the Younger. The city named Iwanu, Anu, or On was the dividing point between Upper and Lower Egypt. It was later called Heliopolis, City of the Sun, by the Greeks, and it was located near Cairo, at the place where the Nile River branched out into the delta. Seth was the third-born son of Geb. He was originally regarded as being equal to his brother Horus the Elder, who was called righteous by God. But after he killed his brother Osiris, this changed how he was viewed by Egyptians. Seth is described as having red skin, and it is said that animals with red or reddish-brown hair or skins, and even red-haired men, were supposed to be especially under the influence of Seth. Back in that pre-dynastic period, Egyptians gave ignominious treatment to those people who had redness of complexion, because it was imagined that they bore resemblance to Seth. The common name for Seth in southern Egypt was Nubti, and Nubt was the pre-dynastic town which was the center of his cult. Nubt was later called the city of Ombos. The town's name was probably changed to Ombos after Seth killed his brother Osiris. Seth came to be known as Bebo, Smai, and Sutek. The Greeks called him Typhon, and these names all refer to violence and subversion. Seth started out equal to his brother Horus the Elder, but became evil in the eyes of the Egyptians after he killed his brother Osiris. However, Egyptians still attempted to obtain his favor by means of offerings and prayers. We can understand this attitude of the Egyptians because after the death of Geb's first two sons, Seth became the oldest living son of Adam, or Geb, who was now the sun god Ra. This made Seth the most important living son of the first man, Geb. Since we have seen that Osiris and his wife Isis were black, and Seth is said to have reddish skin and reddish hair, let's jump ahead in time and talk about Noah. Noah descended from Adam's son, Seth, and the Bible says Noah was perfect in his generations. This indicates there was no racial mixing from Seth to Noah. So Noah may have had reddish skin and reddish hair just as Seth did. And Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were all the same race as Noah and his wife. But historians recognize that Noah's three sons fathered three different races. Ham fathered the black people, Shem fathered the Semitic people, and Japheth fathered the Oriental people. But how could this happen if the three sons of Noah were all the same race as Noah and their mother? Well, Jewish tradition says that Ham married a descendant of Cain, and since Cain and his wife were black in the Egyptian story, then Ham became the father of black people by his black wife after the flood. Shem is recognized as the father of the Semitic peoples, so he married a woman of the Semitic race. Japheth is said to be the father of the Oriental peoples, so he must have married a woman of the Oriental race. But where did these different races come from originally? Well, it is known that a woman has, from birth, all the eggs she will ovulate during her childbearing years, and those eggs have the DNA from both her parents. So her DNA and the DNA of the man who fathers her children determines the race of her children. Up to now, we have talked about women who were born having DNA from both her parents. But there is one woman in this story who was never born. That woman was Mother Eve of the Bible and Mother Nut of Egypt. Mother Eve was made by God from the rib of Adam, and the Egyptian creation story says that Mother Nut was made when Shu forcibly separated Nut from the embrace of Geb. This was like God taking Eve from the rib of Adam. The Bible doesn't tell us where the races came from, but the Egyptian story tells us that the first woman, Mother Nut, brought forth her firstborn daughter, Isis, in the form of a black-skinned or blackish red-skinned child. Historians also recognize Nut's firstborn son, Osiris, as a black man from northern Africa, and Mother Nut's third-born son was Seth, who had reddish skin and reddish hair. So it appears that the first woman, Nut, gave birth to the different races that we see on earth today. Eve and Nut were two names for the first woman, and we see that she wasn't born, so she didn't have DNA from a father and mother. She had DNA created in her by God, and God created in her all the eggs she would ovulate during her childbearing years. Those eggs were given DNA by God that would allow her to give birth to a variety of different races and characteristics in all her children. And those children had offspring that came up during the time of Noah and his sons. The women of those offspring married Noah's sons and brought the different races through the flood. The mixing of those races after the flood has brought about the variety of races we see today. Now that we see how the races came through the flood, we can go back in time and develop the first family of the Bible and Egypt with a more complete understanding. We left the story with Geb, the first man, Adam, settling a battle between his two sons, Horus the younger and his half-brother Seth. They were half-brothers because they both had the same father, Geb, but different mothers. Nut was the mother of Seth, and Isis was the mother of Horus the younger. It is said that there was a total of 3 battles between these two half-brothers. The first battle was settled by their father Geb when he divided Egypt and gave Upper Egypt to Seth and Lower Egypt to Horus. Egypt was divided at the city Anu, or On. It was the religious capital of the sun god Ra, who was Geb, or Adam, the first man. Horus the younger and Seth ruled their respective halves of Egypt peacefully for a time, but Horus the younger still wanted revenge against Seth for the death of his alleged father, Osiris. The followers of Horus were called Shemsu-Heru. They were workers in metal, or blacksmiths. They helped Horus establish his supremacy in Behutet, which is modern Edfu. Horus of Behutet was described as Lord of Forge City, Edfu, where tradition says he first established himself as the great master blacksmith. In the year 363 of the reign of Ra-Harakti, who was Geb, or Adam, the first man, he was in Nubia with a mighty army. Men gave reverence to Ra for a time, but when he grew old, men mocked him. Seth, the evil one, rebelled against his father Ra, for he was advanced in years. Ra came down the Nile to Edfu, where his son Horus of Edfu joined him. Ra told Horus to arm himself and slay the enemies of Ra. This battle between Horus and Seth took place on the 26th day of the month Thoth, which is October, in the year 363 of the reign of Ra, or Geb. After the battle, Horus took Ra and the goddess Ast, or Astarte, who was Isis, the first royal wife of Ra, and they looked over the battlefield of corpses. But Seth wasn't found. Horus gathered his band of smiths and made weapons of iron. The remainder of Seth's army fled with Horus in pursuit. Another battle ensued, wherein the followers of Seth were again vanquished. Yet another battle was to take place in the south land, in which the followers of Seth were utterly destroyed. There are various endings to this story. In each account of the battles, Horus the Elder and Horus the Younger are utterly confused at the end. So while Horus the Elder fights the battles, Horus the Younger kills Seth. They are looked upon as one and the same person. They were actually both brothers of Osiris. Horus the Elder was a full brother because they both had the same father and mother, Geb and Nut. Horus the Younger was only a half-brother because he had the same father, Geb, but a different mother, Isis. The modern archaeologist E. Wallace Budge says that it is true there is confusion identifying the two Horuses because of the scribes who recorded the stories. In the above story, Ra-Harakti was advanced in years, so let's look at the ages of those involved in this story. Earlier in time, we saw that Atem, the dead sun god, gave his father Geb a throne and the title ruler of the world. It is certain that Atem was still alive as Abel of the Bible, or Horus the Elder of Egypt, when he called his father ruler of the world. We saw that Abel, who became Atem, was born when Adam was about 50 years old, and he lived about 30 years before he called his father ruler of the world. So Adam, or Geb, received a throne and became ruler of the world about 80 years after he was created by God. Then Cain killed Abel before Seth was born, when Adam was 130 years old. But the dead man Abel was not elevated to God's status of Atem until Enos was born, 235 years after Adam was created. So Adam was 80 years old when he received a throne and was called ruler of the world. If we go back to the year 363 of the reign of Ra-Harakti, we can add 80 and see that Adam, or Geb, was 443 years old. And since Seth was 130 years younger than his father Geb, he would have been 313 years old when he rebelled against his father, who was advanced in years. So at this time, when battles between Seth and Horus the Younger were being fought, when Geb was 443 years old, Horus the Elder could not have been part of those battles, because he was already dead when Geb was 130 years old. These long ages agree with the Bible, which gives Adam, or Geb, who was Ra, a total age of 930 years. Then he died. After the battle between Horus and Seth in the year 363 of the reign of Ra, there is a myth that says Egypt came under the sway of Horus the Younger. This myth may be an actual conquest of Seth in Upper Egypt by Horus from Lower Egypt before Dynasty 1. Horus the Younger, or child, had several names, and we're going to look at two of them. Number 1, Sma-Tawi-Pikart. He was the son of Hathor, or Isis. He was also Horus the unifier of South and North. Number 2 is Horus-Sma-Tawi. He was also the son of Hathor and the unifier of South and North. The pre-dynastic unification of Egypt is not a myth. Horus the Younger is actually King Sma, who conquered Seth around 3541 BC and unified Upper and Lower Egypt before Dynasty 1. The Egyptians do say that Horus the Younger won a battle against Seth, and by that win he established himself as the son of Osiris and the legitimate heir to Geb's throne, and Seth was banished. This happened in the year 363 of Geb's reign, when he was 443 years old. If you subtract 443 from the creation date of 3984 BC, you get 3541 BC. So Horus the Younger began ruling all Egypt in 3541 BC. This is another key date in pre-dynastic Egypt. It has been stated that Horus and Seth fought 3 battles. We have seen 2 of those battles so far. The first battle was sometime after Osiris was killed, 263 years after Geb was created. Geb settled the battle by dividing Egypt and giving Upper Egypt to Seth and Lower Egypt to Horus the Younger. The second battle saw that Horus won and took control over all Egypt in the year 363 of the reign of Ra. That was in 3541 BC. The third battle may require that we look at an event in the 19th dynasty and derive the date for the third battle. Around 1325 BC, during the 19th dynasty, a monument was set up in Tanis by Ramses II. The monument is known as the Stele of 400 Years. The meaning of the stele is not exactly certain. It is assumed that it commemorates at Tanis the introduction of the cult of Seth by the Hyksos kings. This took place at the beginning of the Hyksos dynasties around 1725 BC, 400 years before the Ramessid dynasty around 1325 BC. Let me inject a detail about the city of Tanis that many people are not aware of. The Hyksos kings actually ruled from the city of Horus in the Delta. But in the 12th century BC, the Delta River that Horus was on became heavily silted and dried up. So the city of Horus was moved north to a newly formed city named Tanis on another delta branch of the Nile. This new city, Tanis, received many monuments from Horus and became a representation of the Hyksos capital city at Horus. The text of the stele reads as follows: Year 400, 4th month of the 3rd season, day 4 of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Seth, the great of strength, the son of Ra, he of Ombos, beloved of Ra Harakti, so that he exists forever and ever. The Hyksos began to rule only Lower Egypt from the delta city of Horus, and Seth was their chief god. If Horus was the capital city of the Hyksos kings, one would assume that the Hyksos would make Seth a god of Horus. This did occur. At Horus in Lower Egypt, the Hyksos king Apepa made Seth the greatest of all gods. However, in the stele of 400 years, Seth is referred to as he of Ombos. This is a reference to Seth as the god of Ombos, which is in Upper Egypt in pre-dynastic times, soon after the creation of Geb and Nut. The stele of 400 years might possibly be a duplicate copy of some monument to Seth in pre-dynastic times, which doesn't exist anymore or hasn't been found yet. It's possible that the stele of 400 years represents the timing of 2 events. The first event would be some timing during Seth's life in pre-dynastic Egypt. The second event would be the 400 years from the Hyksos elevation of Seth to be the greatest of all gods in 1725 BC. Then in 1325 BC, Ramses II set up the stele of 400 years. We have identified 2 of the 3 battles between Horus the Younger and Seth. Now we need to find and identify the third battle. The first battle was after Osiris was killed, and Horus fought Seth over the throne of Osiris. That was 263 years after Geb was created, in the year 3721 BC, and Geb divided Egypt between his 2 sons in order to settle the battle. The second battle was in the year 363 of the reign of Ra, or Geb, which was 3541 BC. Horus won this battle, unified Egypt, and banished Seth. The third battle may have been in the year 400 of the reign of Ra or Geb. Geb was called ruler of the world about 80 years after he was created. So add 80 and see that the third battle took place 480 years after Geb was created. Subtract 480 from the creation date of 3984 BC and see that the third battle may have taken place in 3504 BC. So to summarize the three battles, battle number 1 was 263 years after Geb was created. This was the year 3721 BC. This resulted in Egypt being divided between Seth and Horus the Younger. Battle number 2 was in the year 363 of the reign of Ra, which was 3541 BC. This resulted in Horus the Younger controlling all of Egypt as a reunified nation. Battle number 3 was in the year 400 of the reign of Ra, or Geb. This was in 3504 BC. It appears that Seth divided Egypt by taking back control of Upper Egypt with great strength and ruled from Ombos. After the battle in 3504 BC, Egypt remained divided until it was reunified again under Menes, the first pharaoh of Dynasty 1. That unification under Dynasty 1 took place in 3283 BC. See my YouTube video, Egypt, When Did Dynasty 1 Begin?, to view the timing from the Bible, the Egyptian timing from the Turin Papyrus, and the carbon dating of clay tablets from King Scorpion's tomb. These were all used to establish the date of 3283 BC for the beginning of Dynasty 1. We're going to look at that unification, but first, let's look at the family origin of King Menes. Going back in this story, we saw that Geb, the first man, was first called Urpat, a chief of the human family. Then about 80 years after Geb was created, he was given a throne and was called ruler of the world by Atem. Then, before Geb was 130 years old, Osiris or Cain killed his brother Horus the Elder, or Abel, who became Atem, the dead sun god. That was the story of Cain killing his brother Abel. When Abel or Horus the Elder was killed, Geb became Kenti Amenti, chief of the people of the west at Abydos. They were the ones who were dead and buried in the west where the sun sets. He also acquired the white crown, which is a symbol of his position as Kenti Amenti. And when Enos was born, 235 years after Geb was created, the dead Horus the Elder was elevated to the god status of Atem, the dead sun god. Geb was also elevated to the god status of Ra, the sun god, at full strength during midday. When Geb became a god, he gave his earthly throne to his firstborn son Osiris. Osiris ruled for 28 years and was killed by his younger brother Seth. When Osiris was killed, his wife Isis became the first royal wife of her father, Ra the sun god, who was Geb, the first man created by God. Egyptians say that Geb was ruddy-faced and that he had reddish skin, so God most likely created Eve, or Nut, to be the same race with a ruddy face and reddish skin, just like her husband Geb, the first man. But we know from the earlier presentation in this story that Nut had a firstborn son, Osiris, who was recognized as a black man from northern Africa. Nut also brought forth her firstborn daughter in the form of a black-skinned or blackish-red-skinned child. So the first son and daughter of Nut were a black boy and a black girl. They grew up and became husband and wife and had a firstborn son named Baba in Egypt, and he was black. But after Osiris was killed by his younger brother Seth, Isis became the first royal wife of Ra, the sun god, who was Geb, the first man God created. Geb, or Ra, and his daughter Isis, who became his wife, had a son named Horus the Younger. This son had several names. Number 1, Sma Tawi Pikart. He was son of Hathor, who was Isis. Number 2, Ahi, son of Hathor, or Isis. Number 3, Heru-Henu, he was Horus the child. Number 4, Heru-Sa-Ast, he was Horus, son of Isis. Number 5, Heru-Pi-Kart, he was dweller in Busiris and Horus the child. Since Horus the younger was born from a father who had ruddy or reddish skin and a mother who was black, then Horus the younger was half black. Horus grew up and married his mother Isis, or Hathor, and they had a daughter named Neith who was 3/4 black. The name Hathor comes from the hieroglyphs Het Heru, which means house of Horus. Het means house and Heru means Horus. Isis took this name when she married her son Horus and became a part of his house or family. Their daughter Neith married a pre-dynastic king named Narmer, who was the son of pre-dynastic king Scorpion and his wife Queen Shesh I. So Narmer was married to Neith, who was 3/4 black, and they had a son named Aha-Menes, who became the first pharaoh of dynasty number 1. A small carving of the face of Aha-Menes shows that he had black features, so it may be that Menes' father, King Narmer, and Narmer's father, King Scorpion, came from the black line of Baba, son of Osiris and Isis. Menes is the first name listed in the first dynasty by Manetho. Narmer is the first name listed in the first dynasty by Cambridge Ancient History. Aha-Menes is the second king listed in Cambridge Ancient History. So which list of kings gives the correct first king? The activities of Scorpion and Narmer occurred during the period just prior to the dynastic era. Scorpion vigorously expanded the southern kingdom of Upper Egypt. King Narmer is shown on the front of the Narmer palette to be conquering an enemy while wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. On the reverse of the palette, Narmer is shown wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt. King Narmer is a likely candidate for the title Unifier. Hor-Aha is the Horus name for Aha. It means fighting hawk. Men or Min is the Nubti name for Aha. It means established. This name is probably a clue in establishing who was the first king of dynasty number 1. Aha-Men married his mother, Neith, and she became Queen Neith. An ivory plaque bearing both the Horus name and the Nubti name of Aha-Menes was found in the tomb of Nehthetep, or Queen Neith, the mother-wife of Aha-Men. Abydos is the gravesite of Aha-Men and Narmer and other First Dynasty kings and queens. We know that dynasties 1 and 2 all descend from Aha-Menes. So why is this family divided into 2 dynasties? I want to finish this story with this last thought. From the numbers I have obtained about the length of reigns for the kings in the first 2 dynasties, I have calculated that dynasty number 1 ended 932 years after Geb was created. It may be a coincidence, but Adam or Geb died being 930 years old. The numbers I have and my calculations may not be exact. It may be that Geb's death at 930 years old is the actual end of dynasty number 1. The death of Adam or Geb brought an end to a unique era in world history. These ancient people lived with the first man God created. They lived together for a long time. Geb began as the Urpat, chief of the human family. Then 80 years into his life, he was given a throne and a title, ruler of the world. And within 130 years of his life, his son Horus the Elder was killed, and Geb became Khenti-Amenti, the chief of the people of the west at Abydos. Those people are the ones who are dead and buried in the west where the sun sets. 235 years into Geb's life, Enos was born, and men began to be called gods. Geb's dead son, Horus the Elder, was elevated to Atem, the dead sun god. And since Geb was still alive, he was elevated to the god Ra, the sun at full strength, at midday. When Geb became a god, he gave his earthly throne to his firstborn son, Osiris. Many things happened in the life of Adam, or Geb, the first man. When he died, the people of the human family grieved for the man who brought them all into the world. It was the end of an era and the end of dynasty number 1. The end of Geb's life is where I wanted this video to end, but I have to tell you that I left out of this video some details about Egypt that are in my book. I thought the details were not necessary for the telling of this story. However, I now believe that some of those details should be added to make a more complete picture of the events in this first human family on Earth. The main detail I want to examine is the priesthood that gained supreme authority at Abydos before the unification of Egypt under Dynasty 1. Let's go back to the beginning. Egyptians believed that they were the issue of the great God who created the universe, and they were of directly divine origin. And since Geb was the first Egyptian, he was the first issue of that God. The Bible says God created Adam as the first human, so Geb and Adam were both the same man who was brought forth by the Creator God. In the Egyptian story, Geb had 3 sons named Kensu, Horus the Elder, and Seth. They were all born from his wife Nut. Geb also had a son named Horus the Younger, born from his own daughter, Isis. Isis was the first daughter of Nut, and she was born at the city Dendera. Isis also became the goddess of Dendera. Another name for Dendera was home of the children of Geb, or Adam. Priests of Dendera claimed that Nut, or Eve, made her home at Dendera. Hathor was said to be the wet nurse and wife of Horus the Younger. The name Hathor comes from the hieroglyphs Het-Heru. Het means house, and Heru means Horus. So this name Hathor means house of Horus. Isis is the name of this first daughter of Nut early in life, when she was the mother who gave birth to Horus the Younger and nursed him as a child. Geb was the father of Isis, and he was also the father of her son, Horus the Younger. Hathor is the name of Isis after she married her own son and became part of her son's house or family. This is the same as a woman taking the family name of her husband in today's practice and becoming part of his family. Now let's look at Horus the Elder. In the earlier part of this video, we saw that the second son of Geb was Horus the Elder, and he had the attributes of the great cosmic moral creator God. He was also the same man as the second son of Adam in the Bible, who was righteous Abel. In the Bible, Cain killed his brother Abel. In the Egyptian story, that would be the same as Kensu, or Osiris, killing his brother Horus the Elder, or Abel. When Horus the Elder was killed, his father Geb took the title Kenti-Amenti, which means he became the chief of the people of the west at Abydos. They were the people who were dead and buried in the west where the sun sets. Geb gave himself a white crown, which indicates his position as Kenti-Amenti. There is a man in ancient Egypt named Atem. He was the first man among Egyptians who was believed to have become divine, and who was at his death identified with the setting sun. Atem was the first living man-god known to the Egyptians. Atem was also the son of Nut. So if Nut was Eve and she had a son who was the first to die, then Atem could be none other than Abel, who was the first man to die in the Bible. And we know that Abel of the Bible is Horus the Elder of Egypt. In Genesis 4, verses 2 through 7, we meet the man named Abel. He was good, and his offerings were accepted by God. In Matthew 23:35, God called Abel a righteous man. We know that Horus the Elder had the attributes of the great cosmic moral creator God. So Abel and Horus the Elder were both righteous in the eyes of God. Horus the Elder, or Abel, would not approve of men worshiping him as a god. But after he died, men began to worship him. When Enos was born in 2:35 a.m., the Bible says that men began to call themselves by the name of the Lord. So men were calling themselves gods. Atem was the first living man-god known to the Egyptians. He was worshipped as Atem, the dead sun god. And since Geb, the father of Atem, was still alive, he was elevated to the god status of Ra, the sun god. He represented the sun at full strength during noontime. When Geb was elevated to the god status of Ra, the sun god, in 3749 BC, he gave his earthly throne to his firstborn son Kensu, who changed his name to Osiris. Osiris ruled Egypt for 28 years and was killed by his younger brother Seth in 3721 BC. Horus the Younger did battle against Seth to determine who would rule over Egypt in place of the dead Osiris. Geb stopped the battle by dividing Egypt and giving Upper Egypt to his son Seth and Lower Egypt to his son Horus the Younger. Geb divided Egypt at the city Iwanu. Atem, or Abel, was the first god of the city Iwanu because he was the first man to be killed. Atem was also the chief local god of Iwanu. The city Iwanu is also called Anu, or On, and was later called Heliopolis, City of the Sun, by the Greeks. Egyptians say that Atem was the first man to replace animals as gods. At this same time, Geb, the first man, was also elevated to the god status of Ra, the sun god, at full strength, at noontime. The two gods were eventually combined as Ra Atem and shared the city On as the center of their cult. In time, the living sun god Ra became supreme at the city On, and since Ra was Geb, the first man, On became the throne city of his wife Nut, who was Eve. Later, in 3541 BC, Horus the Younger did battle against Seth again. This time he reunified Egypt before Dynasty 1 and banished Seth. You may remember earlier in this video that Isis fabricated a story that made her husband Osiris to be the father of her son Horus the Younger. This allowed her son Horus to rule on the throne of his father Osiris, just like Osiris ruled on the throne of his father Geb. So when Horus the Younger defeated Seth and unified Egypt in 3541 BC, he established himself as the son of Osiris and rightful heir to the throne of Geb. He unified Egypt for a time. This marked the first reunification of Egypt since the early judgment of Geb, which divided Egypt between Horus the Younger and Seth. When Horus, the alleged son of Osiris, conquered Seth and unified the two lands, Horus gave homage to Osiris and commanded that Osiris rule among the gods on that day of the union of the two earths before Nebertcher. That day of the gathering of the two earths, Upper and Lower Egypt, is at the sarcophagus of Osiris. Osiris had ruled Egypt for 28 years after his father Geb was elevated to Ra, the sun god. Seth killed Osiris in 3721 BC. After ruling for 28 years, Osiris had come to be the god who was dead, but still alive. Horus kept his father alive in another world. Ra ordered Thoth to make Osiris victorious over his enemies. This suggests that Horus and Ra, or Geb, must have had a part in creating the cult of Osiris. Finally, the third battle between Horus the Younger and Seth took place in 3504 BC. Seth divided Egypt by taking back control of Upper Egypt, ruling from Ombos. From this time in 3504 BC, Egypt remained divided until Menes united Egypt at the beginning of Dynasty 1 in 3283 BC. During this time of division, priests gained supreme authority in Egypt. Their chief seat was at Abydos. Up until 3504 BC, supreme authority over all Egypt was maintained by Geb, the first man, then his firstborn son Osiris. After the death of Osiris, Horus the Younger and Seth ruled over a divided Egypt. Then Horus the Younger unified Egypt in 3541 BC before Dynasty 1. And finally, Seth divided Egypt again in 3504 BC. From 3504 BC until 3283 BC, when Menes united Egypt in Dynasty 1, wars raged between Upper and Lower Egypt. During that period, priests gained supreme authority in Egypt. Around 3300 BC, King Scorpion marched his armies from Upper Egypt down to about the Memphis area. King Scorpion was one of the last pre-dynastic kings. He was a native of Nekhen, or Hierakonpolis. He brought wars as far north as Tura, north of Memphis. Narmer succeeded Scorpion and made wars into the Delta region and claimed the Lower Egyptian crown. It is doubtful that he was able to unify the two lands, but Narmer laid the political foundation of the unified Egypt by wearing both the red and white crowns. He is the first monarch shown wearing both crowns. The Narmer palette shows Narmer conquering an enemy while wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. On the reverse side of the palette, he is shown wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt. Menes succeeded Narmer. The name Menes means established. He is credited with the achievement of establishing the unity of the two lands in 3283 BC. He is the first king of Dynasty 1. Prior to the reign of Menes, the priests exercised supreme authority in Egypt. Their chief seat was at Abydos. Menes broke the power of those priests. They represented Menes as a corrupter of the simplicity of primitive manners and the introducer of habits of luxury and effeminacy, including that of reclining on a bed or a couch at meals. We need to find out who those priests were, the ones whose power Menes had to break, and whose chief seat was at Abydos. The chief seat of worship for Horus the Elder, or Atem, was at Abydos. Before Dynasty 1, the cult of Anhur, who was Horus the Elder, or Abel, was supreme at Abydos. We can understand the worship of Atem as a god when we learn that Horus the Elder, or Atem, had a son named Panabtawi. This son was called Lord of the Double Country. He may be the one responsible for creating the cult of Atem, his dead father. His father was called Righteous by God, and Egyptians recognize his righteousness by saying he had the attributes of the great cosmic moral creator God. Abel, or Horus, was called righteous by God, but his son Panabtawi was not righteous in God's eyes because he was part of a false religion, worshiping a false god, namely his own father, who was worshipped as the dead sun god Atem. Panabtawi very likely had a great amount of notoriety among Egyptians because of his righteous father. As the leader of his father's cult, Panabtawi may be the priest who gained supreme authority in Egypt during the time when wars raged from 3504 BC to 3283 BC. Panabtawi would have ruled as Lord of the Double Country from Abydos, his father's cult center. That's where Menes broke the power of the priests and conquered Lower Egypt. In the earlier part of this video, we saw that Abel, or Horus the Elder, was killed before 1:30 a.m. when Seth was born. At that time, Horus the Elder became known as Anhur, Horus the Great. So Abel, who became the dead sun god Atem, was also Anhur and Horus the Elder. The center of the religious cult for this man was at Abydos. Later, when Osiris was killed by Seth, the head of Osiris was buried at Abydos. That made Abydos very important to the worshippers of Osiris. When Menes established Dynasty 1, the cult of Anhur was thrust out of Abydos by the cult of Osiris. Osiris was killed at Abydos, and that city eventually became the chief city in which his cult was celebrated. So in conclusion, we can say that the priesthood that was supreme at Abydos before Dynasty 1 was most likely led by Panabtawi, the son of righteous Abel in the Bible. Panabtawi was called Lord of the Double Country, and righteous Abel became the dead sun god Atem in Egypt. There is much more to this story, but I choose to end it here with the end of Dynasty number 1 and the end of the life of the first man, Geb, or Adam, after a long life of 930 years.